Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode will not be your last one. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to the main event today, if you're on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other audio platforms. If you're on those, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who want to continue to support us monetarily through donation, we have many avenues you can travel for that. For those that are looking at doing a one-time donation, you're still getting a feel for what we do with Identity Talk. You can donate through Cash App with our handle $IDTALK4ED or Venmo using the handle @KwameSM or PayPal using the URL paypal.me/KwameSM. But then for my day ones, for those who have been with the Identity Talk family from the beginning or you joined in the middle, whenever you join and you love what you've been receiving content-wise, please consider being a patron. We have exclusive perks there. We have behind-the-scenes footage, early access videos that you can watch before the public gets to see it, and many other things that are exclusive there. So if that's something that's to your liking, make sure you become a patron today. Go to patreon.com. It's as simple as typing in my name, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and the Identity Talk page pops right up. And of course, to catch future and past episodes of the podcast, make sure you go to our main website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. Now, as I've been saying for months, the book is almost here. Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culture-Affirming Classroom. This is a book, as I've mentioned, 3 years in the making, 3 years of hard work, 3 years of collaboration, 3 years of leaning into community to make this book happen. I couldn't be more proud of the amazing people who contributed to getting this book to the finish line. Well, almost to the finish line. We still got a few more weeks to go. And you can order it today on Amazon or through our main website, learningtorelearn.com. Over there, you'll be able to get some access to free learning resources, as well as an overview of each of the chapters that will appear in the book. This is a read that's going to contribute to the conversation around the importance of affirming the identities of our students, no matter where they come from, no matter how they decide to express themselves. This is the book that's going to be a part of that conversation. And I hope that you get your copy today. And thank you for the support, as always. All right, y'all. So I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but today's guest is somebody that I was introduced to when I was going through my publisher free agency, if you will. So originally, when I started this journey 3 years ago, I had signed on to a different publisher. Unfortunately, there are some things that didn't work out internally, so I decided to end that contract and join another publisher, which ended up being Stenhouse. And when I first signed on, one of the things that intrigued me about Stenhouse was the fact that you started to see an influx of justice-centered teacher educators who are writing some amazing work. And one of those people who I came across was today's guest, who's been doing some amazing work in the literacy world. And she just is a multi-hyphenate. There's so many ways that you can describe her work and what she does, but all I can say is she's a real one, and only real ones get on this stage here on Identity Talk. So without further ado, I want to bring on Nawal Qarooni to the podcast to talk with us about her journey, her book, and what's going on in her life. So let's bring Nawal on so we can have this conversation.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you on. How we feeling?
I mean, I loved that intro, multi-hyphenate.
You do a lot.
Thank you.
You do a lot. And hopefully in this hour, we can break down as much of that work as we can so people know just the depths of what you do. But before we do that, I do want to start from the beginning. And of course, with every guest that comes on here, I make sure I do my due diligence, do my research. I listen to all the podcasts and all the interviews because you don't want me to be redundant and ask you the same questions you heard 10, 15, 20 million times. So hopefully we can have a different conversation today. But a question that I always ask people is how they started in education. I know for you, you have a very special story that involves your aunt who was living in your house when you were 10 and you were teaching her how to read.
Oh my goodness, you did do your research.
You teach her how to read. I believe the book was a Roald Dahl book, the
Oh,
BFG, a classic.
oh my, oh my.
So I don't know if that was something that you just did in your spirit and you were thinking, okay, I'm going to be a teacher one day, or just like, no, I want to help out my aunt. I want her to be able to speak English so we can have some communication with each other, understand each other better. But let's start there. Let's start with the childhood and what it was like growing up.
Thank you for knowing that story. I don't think I wanted to be a teacher growing up. I really wanted to be a pediatrician. I always wanted to work with kids. I
All right.
always wanted to, it was a confluence of my parents saying that I should be a doctor and me being like, but I'm obsessed with children. How can I do both? And me always saying, I guess I'm going to be a pediatrician. I spoke Farsi and my aunt also spoke Persian, right? So I didn't need English for communication. She desperately wanted to learn how to read and write in English. She kept coming and visiting. She would stay with us for a very long time. And we would literally sit on the couch. And whatever it was that I was reading at the time, I would support her in learning how to read. And so, it was Roald Dahl, which you called a classic. I don't know that we are still about Roald Dahl anymore. And now, actually, my daughter one of my kids was just given Matilda by Roald Dahl. And I tried to read it.
Wow.
And it was so arcane. The language was so challenged. I couldn't believe, I was so uninterested in the book. I couldn't believe it. Sure, the story of Matilda is interesting, but oh my goodness. So I think my journey starts in, of course, wanting to, support whoever wants to learn the language. She had a deep motivation, right? Whoever wants to learn something specific. But more than that, I think my journey to education was because of my journalism background and not being able to make change, but only being able to write about it. So I moved into education because I thought, let me try to make change as opposed to just regurgitating information and facts and stories that I'm seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And before we get there, I do want to get a sense of what your schooling was like. So, knowing your parents being immigrants from Iran and how it was like for them living in the States, I'm wondering how that had an influence in your schooling and even your perception of self. Because I know for me, I had parents who came from Ghana and they would tell you what they need to tell you about it, but you didn't really know a whole lot because we didn't get a whole lot of those stories for many reasons, which I'll get into later on. But tell me about how you navigated your schooling. Were there any struggles that you had in terms of embracing that full self and being able to show up authentically in school and all the spaces?
I can't tell you. So much of that has surfaced as an adult and understanding
Yeah.
how assimilationist I tried to be as a result of my parents desperately trying to be so assimilationist. My dad worked at Domino's Pizza, and I was often embarrassed about his work, and he was embarrassed about putting a uniform on and coming to a school that I got a scholarship to, because none of the people's parents, none of my students, the other students there's parents had jobs that, required uniforms. They were lawyers and they were doctors. And I found myself often lying to my parents about the times of the events because I didn't want them coming because I thought they looked different. So I felt inadvertently alienated, but I didn't realize any of this until later. And then I had all this shame about it because why wasn't I so proud about my parents? There were so many factors that went into my own kind of like assimilationist. I wanted to be called Nina because nobody could say my name properly. And it was all kinds of, now I realize, latent inability to be myself. in all the spaces. I don't know that my teachers, purposely did anything to either welcome my families and their ways of being or, alienate them. But I felt other. I felt very other.
And I think for all of us, we do experience some degree of internalized trauma because we don't know our full self and we allow others to tell our stories.
Mhm.
And they try to tell who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to exist. And we just take it at face value because there's no other reference that we have.
That's right.
So yeah, it's deep.
That's
That's
right.
deep. And then you were talking about journalism. So that's what you were doing before you got into teaching. So I'm wondering, thinking back to that experience, how did that help you to understand the power of the counter story, the power of looking at the source from where stories are coming from?
Yeah, I actually marvel all the time at how my journalism training supported the work that I do now. I mean, you had to have balance in your articles. You had to have multiple voices. You couldn't have an entire story hinging on one person. If you were talking to one family member or doing, you had to get the other side. I covered breaking news. And so it was also this real vulnerable place where people were talking about their traumas and talking about their agonies that had just happened. And so getting people to trust you includes building a rapport with them kind of on the fly, really feeling what they're saying. All of that not only speaks to the counter story, but speaks to what we do as educators, which is really hear humanity. And in order to hear humanity, you need to hear multiple voices. It cannot just be one person's story. Those stories, all the stories that I wrote in Breaking News, stay with me, but specifically the people who suffered but opened their heart to me while they were suffering. And so I think about that a lot, because how can you educate somebody who doesn't feel trust with you? And so you have to be able to do that. And I think one of the ways is to hear all the voices.
That's important. And I think with journalism, and I've never been a journalist, but from what I've seen, framing plays a huge role in journalism. The way that you frame a story and the context that you put the stories in. And depend on what newspaper or magazine you write for,
That's right.
they don't want you to show emotion. They just want you to report the story. And sometimes it might require some sensationalism that could be detrimental to the folks who have put trust in you to get their stories out there.
Well, think about, exactly how much context matters.
Yeah.
And how much context matters as an educator. You can't just take stories in isolation. You have to ask who's outside the frame, whose voice is not being heard, right? And you have to ask those very same questions as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message,
I know.
is a prime example of what we're talking about, because he's going directly to the source.
That's right.
He's going to Palestine. He's going to the West Bank. He's talking to the people who are directly impacted by the crossfire. He's trying to get a sense of what's going on. And these are stories that we're not seeing in the main media markets. We have to get from the people.
Yeah. It's no different in education, right? Asking all the people who are affected directly, including the people who you're educating and all of their communities, as collective care and a collective care model. It's the same idea.
So when you made the transition from journalism and into education, what were some of the shifts that you were experiencing as far as how you were getting acclimated into that new space?
I think that honestly, because I went into education for the social work component, because I really wanted to support kids and families and communities, I felt like I was really doing the work. So to me, it felt really validating to make the switch. I wasn't just narrating pain. Instead, I was trying to find solution. I did find pretty quickly that the education system felt similarly stagnant, that often people just kept saying things and telling things. And there were traditional kind of ways that we orchestrated school in ways that didn't serve kids. And so I kept hitting a wall. But at the beginning, it felt very, very validating. because I was building relationships with kids and with families. I had my whole heart and soul in those classrooms. I taught 8th grade in Brooklyn initially. I named my daughter one of my students' names, who I love, my first daughter, Eliana.
What's her name?
Eliana.
Oh, that's a beautiful name.
Thank you. After an 8th grader who I built like a really strong relationship with, So at the beginning, it felt very, very warm. At some point, I started to realize that I felt like my hands were tied and that the systems needed to be broken down. And that's when I think I really started pushing for change in school systems. So,
and then with regard to systems, even in Brooklyn and other places where you've been, there are high immigrant populations over there, which means that you have students coming in who may be first, second, third generation. Students may come from families who are undocumented, whatever their situation is, and that impacts their ability to be fully present in the classroom. So that's where I think for you, the importance of understanding their stories come in, and also understanding the stories of their families come in. So when did you start to make those connections between the parental engagement and seeing some of the things that you saw in your students who may have been struggling?
Well, we moved from Brooklyn to Chicago, and I started teaching in the southwest side of Chicago around McKinley Park, where it's predominantly Mexican. And you're right, it's Mexican, first generation, second generation, undocumented. There's every kind of family.
Right.
I started to realize pretty quickly that you can't bloom before you Maslow. Have you heard this? You have to
Yes.
Maslow before you bloom. I mean, that idea that, again, the social work component was the most important. The kids needed shelter. They needed to feel safe. They needed food. They needed all these things. And if they either didn't feel those things at home or they didn't feel those things at school, we're not going to get to anything in Bloom's taxonomy. We're not going to get to the learning of the facts or the regurgitation of the facts or the synthesis or anything above it. So I firmly believe that you can't separate knowing the children from knowing their families. And once that is just kind of like the mantra, that if you want to deeply know your kids, you have to deeply know their parents, if not their parents, their caregivers. Who are they spending time with outside of the building? What do they do? Like in their communities, what role do they play? What stresses do they have? That then will inform as data how we then know them in the classroom.
For sure. Now, I don't know if this is a case in Iranian culture, but in Ghanaian culture, usually when there are conflicts that take place, like between parents,
Yeah.
I know in my context, my mom went through a lot of emotional abuse from my father and others. And I never knew about those stories until I became an adult. So there are a lot of things that happened during my childhood that I wasn't even aware of until I was old enough to understand what happened. And I mention this because I know you've probably come across families or students who come from families where there is a great deal of trauma, where you have parents who are hiding stories as a way to protect their children and their psyche. In a situation like that, how do you ensure that we can provide that support for students who may not come from the most stable home environment?
Well, I think it's like a couple things. One is that from the standpoint of someone who works with teachers, we have to like unpack our own biases around whether or not we're projecting that families are equipped or not equipped, or want the best for their kids or don't want the best for their kids. Like we've got to put all of that down, because that's like from one angle, we have to make sure that we are not saying, but that family, and then the child becomes that to you in your head, right? And so like you educate them differently if you have biases around how their family is doing, right? From the other direction, it's validating for families that their experiences are worthy of talking about, that their experiences are worthy of like bringing to the table, and or slowing down and processing alongside a kid. I mean, I think for sure there are places where like trauma has to be, like depending on ages, etc. Trauma has to be, I don't want to say hidden, but unpacked at a later time. But I think so much of the work that I do with families is to say, like, you don't need to be perfect to be able to support your kid in growing reading, writing, literacy skills, thinking skills, reading the world, spending time together, identity building, like all these things in your family are big and beautiful and amazing also. Like, what are all these other things? So something I do with families, like a perfect example is I was recently in California and a mother said, like, but my kid never talks to me. He's like so quiet. He won't speak, like he won't anything. And it was, I was organizing a family lab site where everybody was drawing maps of special places that held
Yeah.
stories, because then the kids could then go write about it later. And so they just sat there in silence. And I talked to the mom afterwards about, like, that's a form of communication. You're still, he filled the page alongside his mother, filled the page. And so that is, these kind of like, it's almost like soft coaching, soft validation of families that they are doing amazing in so many ways and can breed closeness, even if they don't think that they are. And so, like, noticing, noting and naming, like, this was incredible because this is how you could lean into it, because, I just listened to a podcast about how the parents are not all right. It's like a New York Times, The Daily podcast, and it has a boatload of research about how parenting is super hard right now in this day and age, because the helicopter parenting is like overly obsessive, and we feel that we have to like constantly parent even in our downtime, and then that's also like a luxury because not everybody has that time, and then families feel guilt, and right. And I just think, so no matter what parent you approach, there's some sort of guilt. No matter what socioeconomic status they're coming from, what kind of background they're coming from, they feel guilt or they think they're messing up their children. Says a mother of 4 who like constantly worries that she's messing up her children, right? Like, this is what I mean. And so I think part of the work in collective care and like in nourishing caregiver collaborations is to name with families the great stuff that exists, the family stories that are worthy of sharing, right?
And I think the work is two-pronged. I mean, for one, you have to help parents expand their understanding of what literacy is. So we think of literacy as, oh, read this book, look at these words. Yes,
Yep.
that's one form of being literate, but also you have your cultural literacy,
Yep.
and that plays a major role in understanding the context
Yep.
of a child and that child's entire family. And I think that's something that gets understated.
That's right. That's 100% one of the premises of both of our work, isn't it? Is to expand this definition of literacy. And
Yeah.
families don't often know that. You asked about my parents, my parents' upbringing and education in Iran. Most of our families have a traditional education that dictates that literacy means reading, writing. Like, they don't even expand it beyond communication. And so that's like so much of the work, I think, too.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yeah, for sure. Especially if we're trying to create different access points for our students to be able to connect to curriculum and be able to have an equitable shot at getting the optimal learning experience that everybody else is getting. Mm-hmm. We got to be expansive in how we think about it. And that also includes our teachers. Mm-hmm. So in thinking about that, I want to talk about your book, Nourishing Caregiver Conversations. Yes, I see it in the back. And first off, I love the fact that you incorporated family into that process. So shout out to your cousin. I know your cousin designed the cover. So that's what's up. Keeping it with the family. Yeah. Love it. Tell me about this amazing book. What are the lessons that you would hope for teachers and anybody else who gets this book to take away from reading it, if you could sum it up in like main points?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think we touched on it a little bit. I think the main premises of the book are that education and schooling are not synonymous. And
Mm-hmm.
so families and educators are trying to achieve the same thing, that they want what's best for the child, and that we need all of the adults in that child's kind of constellation of care to be on board and to support the kid in reading, writing, growing critical thinking, etc. The definition of literacy being expansive so that we can validate the funds of knowledge that families are already bringing is a main premise of the book. And then I go through basically what I call holistic literacy tenets or learning tenets around process and choice and giving kids agency and observational literacy and reading art, reading the world, reading family experiences, to exalt what families are already doing. I think my favorite part of the book is the lab site chapter, potentially, where I talk about inviting families into the classroom to do something alongside their kid in a shared experience so that you can basically validate what they're doing at home and give them some tips, but not until they kind of work alongside their kid in a really authentic way, like looking at family photos, drawing kind of their communities, reading art together, doing something that feels really kind of tangible. I love that because they're the most joyful part. It's the most joyful part of what I do.
And speaking about the observational literacy, that was the one that drew me more than the other types, because I just think about how our children love a good story. You may have what you think is the greatest lesson of all. So I was a middle school math teacher for many years, and some of the best days I've had in the classroom were days that didn't even involve math. It was me just sharing a story about my life that had nothing to do with what I was supposed to teach that day.
That's right.
But yet my students gained so much that day. And I also think about some of the stories that our students bring into the classroom. And the classroom may be the only place for them to share these stories because they can't share them at home with either a sibling or a parent. They may not have anybody to share that with. So, in knowing the power of stories and knowing the amount of book bans that are still taking place in our country and in other parts of the world too, how important is it for teachers to bring in those first person narratives that students come with? How important is that?
Oh my goodness. Unfortunately, so many of our hands are tied right now because of packaged curriculum, because we're swinging very far in the other direction.
Yes.
And I just think that nothing is more valuable than providing a platform and a safe space for kids to tell about themselves, to find connections with other kids through those stories, and to make connections with the adults in the building through stories. Almost nothing is as important because they're not going to remember the actual content if they don't feel the safety of the story and they don't feel being seen. I mean, you think about relationships and long-term relationships, you think about marriages, you think about all these kinds of, what lasts is when you feel seen. That's like literally the number one way that relationships stay strong, and that's how learning sticks. And so there's like almost nothing, I think, more important than, and thinking about the counter story and thinking about really portraying whole picture stories. It is so critically important right now in our country because of how polarized we are, to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. I don't know how to say it more firmly than that.
Yeah. And I just thought about the DNC that just passed in Chicago. So my family lives in Chicago. They live in the South Side. And when I think about Chicago arguably has the largest Palestinian community in the United States. So for the Democratic Party not to invite a single Palestinian American speaker to talk about the stories that we talked about, those first person narratives that we believe are so valuable, I just felt like that was a missed opportunity, for people to hear the other side that's not being told enough.
Listen, I was just talking about this last night, how distasteful I find it when even like our celebrities are not making an outright stance in different locations and places where they're making kind of these tepid, get out the vote type, because they know how polarized we are, and they're not willing to tell the whole story. They're not willing to look at, I just think it's a really, really tense time. And it is our
Yes.
number one obligation to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. The books that are being banned, I'm on the Library of Congress Literacy Advisory Board, by the way. I think about this a lot. The books that are being banned are just stories of people. They are literally books like Hair Love, about a father doing his daughter's hair. Like, they are so wildly ordinary.
The Hair Love, like Matthew Cherry Hair Love.
That's right.
What? Come
That's
on.
right.
They banned that?
That's
Oh.
right. But when you know, like, the ordinariness of the stories, it becomes so silly to you. It becomes such a game because it's just unethical. It's unethical. And so going back to the social work component of the work that we do is heart work, and it's family work, and it's collective care. And so if you don't care about every single child in front of you, that's when you start thinking about banning books and telling single stories.
Yeah. I think the most valuable thing that I've been able to do for my oldest son is to give him a love for reading. Just having that time where we read a bedtime story. We started this when he was around 2 years old, and now he's 6, and it's automatic. It's like, Daddy, we didn't read our bedtime story. It's automatic. It's part of his schedule. Like, he will not go to sleep unless he gets to read a story.
That's right.
And that is an amazing gift to give to a child, especially now where it's hard to access the books that we're speaking of, the books that are being banned. So to be able to give that to your child and to be able to have the ability to get the books into your homes, they can't come into our homes. They can't come into our homes and take those books away. There's an opportunity there to still feed that knowledge into our kids.
You know where else they also can't come? They can't come into our mouths and our hearts. And so oral storytelling is equally important. And so you can tell your family stories. You can tell, I often say that I can't remember where my mom's stories end and mine begin, or where her memories end and mine begin, because she tells me stories about Iran in ways that make me feel like I know them. And she never read books to me, but she always told me stories. And so, like, always encouraging families to talk about their memories, their experiences, their other places. I have an aunt who told me lots of stories about Ghana. She lived in Ghana for 4 years.
Oh, nice.
Yes. And I remember all of those. I remember all the things that she told me about the people who she befriended and who made her bracelets, and how they helped raise her children because she was alone there for 4 years. And, these are the kinds of stories that help shape our identities and help make us stronger connectors when we're in classrooms.
Yeah, my son was able to go to Ghana. We went to Ghana last October. So whole family, wife, kids, everybody. And he was able to meet my father. He had never met his paternal grandfather before. So it was his first time meeting him. He was able to meet his great grandmother. So my grandma still lives in Kumasi. She's approaching 90 years old.
Wow.
So he got a chance to meet her. He got a chance to eat all the food that I grew up eating.
That's amazing.
And he was able to meet some of my cousins and aunts who are still in the country, all in 2 weeks. And he had a whole bunch of stories to tell.
That's right.
Like,
and I wonder if his school teachers recognize those as little moments that he could then write about, tell about, connect with others on.
Yes.
I
mean, he's in an international school, so a lot of kids, they have these kind of experiences where they're able to go and travel to a lot of different places, and we don't take that privilege for granted, being able to do that. But it's something that it seems so simple, but yet it doesn't happen often enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we strip our children of the opportunity to explore the world. Even if the books aren't there for us to do that, there's other ways in which we can allow for that exploration to take place,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for sure. So you mentioned you are a
I am.
mama of four.
I
I
am.
don't, I don't know how you juggle it. I don't know how you juggle the responsibilities. More power to you. I got two, and that's a lot.
I'm
I
telling
got,
you, it's getting harder and harder. You know, when they were little, it was physical. It was like a physical fatigue. Um, Now it's a lot of it's mental. It's, you know, bigger kids, bigger problems for sure.
yeah. So knowing how you grew up with your parents and the experiences that you had, how do you translate those experiences onto your children? How do you build their confidence, their self-efficacy, so they're able to take full ownership of who they are in this world that we live in, where there's a lot of tension right now? How
I
do
mean,
you allow them to thrive?
okay, I'm going to bring it full circle for you,
All right.
because I think that if we give our kids the tools to define themselves, then other people will not define them, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's the main thing, is being able to talk to my kid and say, hey, your name has an H in the middle and it's pronounced. It's ihsan. It means integrity in Arabic. And correct people when they say Isan, or correct people when they call you Sonny, right? Like, and building the confidence in him so that he does the thing that I didn't feel confident doing when I was in
Mhm.
an all-white school saying, call me Nina, right? And so I think that that's the main, is like explaining, talking, telling stories about my roots and how my dad is Arab. He's from Bahrain, but he was born and raised in southern Iran. And my mom is Iranian, and how that means I'm multi-ethnic. Their mother is multi-ethnic, how my husband is Puerto Rican, and where in Puerto Rico is he from? Oh, that's where we got married, not in a destination wedding, but in the town where his grandmother was born, right? Like those kinds of stories, I think, build identity for our kids. And then when they share those stories with their friends are more apt to share about theirs, right? And so I think that it's a cycle. And I don't know, I work really hard at that. Our kids have each a name from both sides. They have like a Latino side, and a name, and one on the kind of Arab Iranian side, and they know their whole, you know, the whole story of why. And I think these things are important. I have a big, long last name on my Bahraini passport. 5, you know, of my patriarchs are in my name. I explain why, and you know, so that they know. These are the kinds of questions that maybe my parents didn't feel readily equipped to talk to me about it until I was old enough to go and ask. And so we do that earlier, and hopefully that they will, you know, they will pass on the torch and continue these 4
And,
children.
and speaking of your parents, were there certain stories that you learned about them that you didn't find out until you became an adult?
You know, that's a real question. Of course, you know, the stories that they felt were either embarrassing
Mhm.
or they wanted to push down for whatever reason because they thought it was trauma. Those are the kinds of things that are coming out now that I'm in my 40s. I talk about this a lot too. My mom's sister died of colon cancer during the pandemic. And before she died, like we had the opportunity, she was like, you know, voted most least likely to die, like the most alive person in our family. And when I went to go say bye to her, it was like looking at these family photographs and asking all these questions that would have been buried with her had we not sat down and asked them. And it was me who said, like, I need these stories because we do not have access to these in the future. These black and white photos, nobody knows who took that photo, who was it outside the frame, what happened in those moments. And like those are the stories that I want all families to capture with their kiddos. You know, like we have, it's like an obligation to be able to platform those for our kids and our families. Um,
Right.
so yeah, some things are coming up. Some things, interestingly.
Yeah. But also those stories is how we're able to connect generations for years to come.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
our children will be able to pass it on to their children, and then that keeps on going, even when we're long and gone. So that's important.
I'm gonna say one more thing, and it's that often parents try to like present themselves as perfect, right?
Yeah.
And like, you know, when our kids recognize that we're just humans doing the best that we can and that we make huge mistakes. And like, I recognize that in my family stories, like, oops, they really didn't know what they were doing. And like, they were dealing with the tools that they had at any given moment. That's so important for us as parents, as caregivers, and as educators, to not present ourselves as perfect, but to say, like, I will think about this alongside you. I'm not quite sure of the answer, but like, let's think together. Or I don't know, but I know where to look or how to ask. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that that's so important for like connecting the generations.
For sure. But I also think for many of our families, there's an aversion to therapy
100%.
that makes it hard for them to unlock those stories that we need to hear. And I know for me, I started taking therapy seriously and emotional intelligence classes seriously when I was 38, 37, 38 years old. I'm now in my early 40s. So that's how many years it took for me to even get to that point. And I've seen a change in myself. And I also think being a parent and being married also plays a role too. When you have somebody else that you gotta look out for, someone else that you feel accountable to, and you want to be your best self to, then that's when you start to be motivated enough to do that self-work. So just through that self-work, I've been able to unlock stories that I've kept in my safe for years.
And we might not be able to get families into therapy, but we
Not
can. But we can validate them and their
sure.
mistake-making spaces, like saying, "It's cool." Like, "It's cool." You know, like,
Mhm.
it's cool to talk about these things in different spaces.
Yes, grace is so important. Grace is so important.
Isn't it, though?
Yeah. So now being a mother, being a consultant, being an educator, holding all these different roles, and I feel like you've done so much already, and there's still so much that you're looking to do. I'm curious, what's next for you? Like, do you feel at peace with where you are? Are there things that you're still exploring?
You changed that question a little, Kwame.
We
Uh,
flowing. We
we're
flowing about we
okay.
flowing.
I sometimes am just like, just enjoy. Don't move. Like, sit in the silence. Do the work, put your head down, enjoy the children. Don't do anything more. My kids actually, when I'm at the computer, they come over and they're like, "Hey, are you writing another book?" Like, they are horrified because they're scared that they're going to lose me to writing another book. I would like to write family stories, my own family stories. I would like to pivot and leave education writing. At some point, the joke that my editor made throughout my writing process was, this is the part where you kill it. Like, you do amazingly in this writing. And then, like, remember, we got to get back to the classroom. That was the joke of the internal structure of each chapter. It was like, the part Nawal really writes. But
Yeah.
right. So I do want to capture those if I can at some point. That's a dream. My little sister is 15 years younger than me. She works in Hollywood. She's an actor and she's a writer and she does voiceovers and she's a super creative. And I have a dream to co-write something with her, like picture books. I have dreams, I have dreams of doing something with her. So I don't know.
All right. You know what? I'm about to check her IMDb page. She
Yeah,
got
you
one.
should. You should.
What's her name?
Should. Her name is Dalia. And we have conversations around this, but she dropped the QA. So she is Dalia, last name Rooney, Rooni. So you can imagine the conversations we've had around dropping the QA.
Oh, that's the stage name.
Uh-huh. But she's kicking butt. She's doing a lot of really, really cool things for Black and brown women in Hollywood. And I do have dreams of working with her if possible. So, I don't know.
All right. That's what's up.
I will
So,
say one last thing though, and that's
yeah.
that I'm constantly working on presence and constantly working on being here right now. Because when you are thinking about the future, you're anxious. And when you are dwelling on the past, you tend to be angry. At least that's how it is with me. And so I work really hard to be here right now. And when I am right here right now, I am at my happiest. So I've recently started to be like, I'll get to that when I can. This is where I am right now. Like, I cannot be anywhere else. Um, and that's like, I think, kind of a forever journey. working on that. It's my tattoo. It's yeah, it's my forever goal.
For sure. And then we can wrap it up with this final question, and it's the one that I ask everybody. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
Forever pursuing growth, never just like being stagnant, but doing what you said, whether that's being in therapy, whether that's looking at my actions and saying, could I have done that differently or better? Just like never staying stagnant, completely stagnant. I think that's when, when you languish. So
All right, short and sweet. And Nawal, thank you so much for
thank you.
coming on. This,
Thank you.
this was such a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
And before we let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you the opportunity to just share how people can connect with you and some of the services you provide to educators, parents, and all those who are very much interested in literacy and building healthy families through literacy.
Thank you so much. So my book is sold wherever books are sold. I had the privilege of recording the audio, so you can also listen to it on audio, which is very interesting and cool.
Nice.
You can see my work at nqcliteracy.org. I'm on socials at NQAROONI on Instagram and Threads, and NQC Literacy on X and TikTok. I work with schools and districts across the country and world, really, in family engagement and really bridging what we're doing in classrooms with including families into curricular work. So my consulting services are explained on my website. I have a small team who work with me, and that's how you can find me.
All right. Make sure you all connect with her. She's doing amazing work. Nawal, thank you. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
And this is a wrap, people. So, on behalf of Nawal, I'm wishing you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.